For those who don't know me, my name's Kevin Pilley. I'm on the Island Plan Review team, and I'll be taking you through some of the introductory parts of the presentation today. Also on the call today is my colleague Ralph. Ralph, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, everybody. My name is Ralph Buchholz, and so I'm going to take you through the actual housing policy side of the presentation today, and things like the sites and the various elements that we've drawn together to write the new chapter.
Okay, and also on the call today is my colleague Natasha Day, who's been involved in the closely involved in the Island Plan Review process. So she'll be just keeping an eye on the comments that are posted in the chat. Could you drive those slides, Ralph? Could you move on to the next slide? Okay, so what we want to cover today is, as I said, I'll just provide some initial comments at the start, just talk a little bit about the consultation phase of the Island Plan Review process, and give you a quick overview of the draft plan, and then Ralph will take you through some of the detailed content of the session today. So if we could move on, Ralph. And again, so we are in the consultation phase of the Island Plan Review process. So the draft plan is live, out to consultation for a 12-week period. That started on the 19th of April and will run through to the 12th of July. The whole purpose of this consultation process is to secure both comments from members of the public and also for states members to engage in this part of the Island Plan Review process, so states members can lodge amendments to the draft plan at this stage. Can you just move on a slide, Ralph? We would encourage you, if you want to submit comments, to use the consultation portal, which can be accessed through the gov.je website, and the links there. A dedicated Island Plan Review page will take you to the consultation portal, and we would encourage you to use that. You can post comments on any aspects of the plan. It's divided up into relevant sections and asks you to specify elements that you want to comment on. We're also accepting representations in other formats, but we would encourage you to use the portal if you're able to do so. Next slide, please, Ralph. In terms of the overall timeline, can you just move on again, Ralph? We are at this stage, as shown in the slide. So obviously out to consultation on for a 12-week period. We will be looking at all of the comments that are made over this period of time. The Minister will be considering those, so both public comments and any comments made by states members. The Minister will then publish an initial response to all of the comments and representations received over this 12-week period. That will be published before an examination in public commences. The examination in public itself is likely to be held in the autumn, and that will involve independent planning inspectors looking at all of the issues that have been raised during the consultation period on the draft plan, looking at the Minister's initial response to those, and focusing in on the key issues that the inspector think need to be addressed. And the inspectors will then produce a report towards the back end of this year, beginning of next year, which the Minister will publish. Minister and states members then get an opportunity to make any amendments or propose any amendments to the draft plan before that's debated in the States Assembly, which will probably take place in March next year. So that's the timeline. Obviously, there's a long way to go, and we would encourage you to engage in this at this particular juncture. So by all means, talk to us and submit your comments, and there will be opportunity to engage further along in the process. If we could move on to the next slide, Ralph. Just in terms of being able to engage with us, obviously the plan's been out for a week or so now, and we are now looking at May as being a really quite intensive period of active consultation and engagement. So this is the first of a series of themed webinars, which will cover all aspects of the plan. So they're running at the start of the weeks over May, mainly on a Monday and a Wednesday. And they're followed up by a themed planner surgery on a Friday. So if you do attend any future sessions, as set out here, they'll take place on a Monday or a Wednesday. And if you've got any more details that you wish to discuss, you can attend a Friday planner surgery session. In addition to that, we will also be holding a number of actual public events. We'll be visiting all of the island's parish halls, public halls, and I think in St Lawrence we're going to the community centre to run a series of drop-in roadshows. So whilst they will have a parish flavour to them, they'll also cover all aspects of the plan. And members of the Island Plan Review team will be available at all of those sessions. We're running those generally in the afternoon into the early evening, and then on Saturdays there's some sessions running on 3 Saturdays in the month of May as well. In addition to that, we'll also be doing some targeted stakeholder engagement and also more detailed engagement with states members. So hopefully that gives you a flavour of some of the opportunities that you've got to come and talk to us. Of course, any queries, questions, the Island Plan at gov.je email address is one you can use to fire any questions to us. Okay, next slide, please, Ralph. So I'll just give you a quick overview of the draft plan. As many of you will be aware, this plan is slightly different than a normal island plan. It's what we're calling a bridging island plan. It's got a shorter plan period, and the reason for producing a plan with a shorter plan period was really around the uncertainty created by both the pandemic and the impact of Brexit on the island. And because of the issues raised by both of those events and challenges, it makes it more difficult to develop a long-term plan. So we've looked to produce a short-term bridging plan, which has got a 3-year plan period, will take us up to 2025. But it does give us an opportunity to address some of the challenges that we know about at the moment. So specifically to address a particular challenge around provision of homes, housing affordability, start to address some of those longer term challenges around things like climate change, for example. So this, whilst it's a short term plan, it's still a full island plan in its coverage, and it will hopefully provide us with some sound foundations to undertake a subsequent island plan review, which we envisage would be a return to the normal 10-year island plan review process, which we will begin not long after the new government's formed in 2022. Okay, next slide, please. So as I've just said, this plan gives us an opportunity to tackle some key issues, to look at the delivery of affordable homes, to look at how the island might recover from both the pandemic and from Brexit. The plan also sets out a comprehensive plan for town, and looks at how we might deal with some particular challenges that face St Helier. It provides us with an opportunity to look at the protection regime for the island's coast and its countryside, but also to have a more comprehensive planning policy regime for the island's marine environment. And there's enhanced provision for protection of biodiversity and geodiversity. And as I mentioned previously, this plan addresses in a more proactive way the challenges of climate change and reflects some of the key implications of that, including flood risk. Okay, next slide, please, Ross. In terms of the form of the island plan, what comprises the plan? Well, two key elements: both the actual written plan, the written document, together with a series of proposals maps. We've had to produce a greater number of proposals maps this time, simply because of the information that's contained on them, specifically around flood risk. So there's both an island-wide proposals map setting out planning zones on one of the maps, and then the other is dealing with the flood risk zones, and that's repeated for the inset map for town. So if you just run through those, right, there's a series of slides. So that's the proposals map with the planning zones. Flood risk is picked up on the second map, and then same again for town. So we've got proposals map and a flood risk map. Okay, next slide, please. I'd also want to just draw your attention to the evidence base that supports the island plan review. In undertaking a review of policy, we seek to ensure that new policy is well based on and well founded on robust evidence. So we've commissioned a range of specific studies which have either been done externally, subject to our specifications, or we've produced them internally within the team. A range of those have been published in advance of the draft plan being published. Some were published with the draft plan. All of those are now available online, with the exception of the sustainability appraisal, which we're just in the process of finalising at the moment. There are some specific pieces of evidence that are of relevance to today's session, and they are specifically the objective assessment of housing need, which was undertaken back in 2019, looking at a range of housing requirements relative to different population scenarios. Out of that, or that informed the preparation of a preferred strategy for the island plan, which we published last year in October. And there's some key evidence-based pieces of work which have been undertaken to assess things like landscape character, which have obviously been important in terms of informing site selection, together with things like new material considerations like the assessment of flood risk. So when you're looking at the plan, please be conscious that a lot of the material there is based on the evidence base, and that's available for you to peruse as well. In much of the plan, the appropriate evidence is hyperlinked, so you should be able to go through to the relevant sections of the evidence base. Alternatively, it's all available on the island plan dedicated webpage under the core evidence base list. We're just going to touch briefly on the structure of the plan. Just move on a bit. Well, thanks. So the plan is slightly different to, or the draft plan is slightly different to the current plan. It's now set out into 4 volumes, that we've called them. So introduction and strategic proposals at the top, some strategic policies in volume 2, which provide a strategic policy framework, together with a new element in the plan. There's a section on places, where we provide some overarching policy which sets the expectation for the level and form of development in different parts of the island. And then that's followed by volume 3, which has a series of thematic chapters which set out key policies around different aspects that the planning system touches on. And then finally, volume 4 talks around the monitoring framework that will be used to assess how the plan's performing. There was a reduction in the number of policies in the plan. Some of those are as a result of policies no longer being required or simply being amalgamated and merged to provide some simplicity in the policy regime. It's the usual format for the plan in terms of how the policies are presented. So there's a preamble with some of the justifications for the subsequent policies that follow. They're set out in blue boxes, and there are also a series of proposals which are set out in green boxes in the plan. Some of those proposals relate to work that will be undertaken during the plan period to either issue guidance or do some more work in relation to a specific issue or aspect. So that's the structure and content. And just move on, Ralph. Yeah. So and this is really how it works in practice. So obviously the strategic context of the plan wraps around the whole thing. Strategic policy framework, and the places section provides an overarching framework for the whole island, some of which has a spatial expression, and then the managing development policies, the thematic policies, sit in the core of the plan. Clearly, when you're looking at a particular development proposal or looking to use the plan in anger, you need to have regard to the plan as a whole, and policies shouldn't just be read in isolation. Okay. Okay, so that was a quick scoot through the consultation process, the timeline, and some of the issues around structure of the plan. I don't know if there's any questions or queries at this stage before I hand over to Ralph to pick up some of the detail on the housing policy.
I think there's been a few questions put in by Mike. Actually, I think it's come on screen there, and some responses. Do you want to, Mike? Do you want to make some comment?
I was just wondering, on the penultimate slide, there was something called the Jersey Performance Structure.
The Jersey Performance Framework. Yep.
And I wondered if you could explain what that was, please.
Yeah, you'll know that the government has been looking at how the island or the sort of progress on various initiatives in the island should be assessed and measured. The island's made a number of changes to its sort of monitoring framework. A lot of this is derived from Future Jersey and the various objectives that were set by the community around all aspects of island life, covering economic, environment, and social elements, out of which have been developed a whole series of indicators. And there are clearly various policy vehicles that respond to some of those indicators, the island plan being one of them. Jersey's quite advanced in the sense of seeking to measure performance against sustainable well-being criterion rather than just purely a monetary GVA or GDP type measure. And so the Jersey Performance Framework provides a whole range of indicators across those, as I say, economic, environmental and social elements that are of importance to island life. And the plan will fit into that framework and will be monitored against some of the indicators in there. So I don't know if that answers your question, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, could there be a diagram that showed what those frameworks were that sort of feed into that outer layer? I think it'd be quite interesting to see that bigger picture.
Yeah, we don't have that on the on this current deck, but we can provide more information on that.
Thank you.
Oh, Mike, I just posted into the chat the link to the Jersey Performance Framework, which sets out basically the wheel of how the key issues are considered across environment, community and economy, and then the key performance indicators below that. You might find that link useful.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'll hand over to Ralph now, who will take you through the housing policies in the plan.
Thanks, Kevin. Right, so just as a general overview first, just to give you some sort of headline ticket items, I suppose. There's been a greater collaboration with the housing minister around particularly the housing policies. You'll also sort of note that the Chief Minister's published recently the Housing Policy Development Board report, which has been a very useful vehicle for addressing and sort of looking in depth, I suppose, at some of the more sort of nuanced housing issues. A lot of which obviously will have a direct island plan relationship. Some of them don't. Some of them are more related directly to the housing minister's portfolio and around the gateway and social rental policy and that sort of thing. But there's some very direct land use based sort of background elements to that report, which have been very useful in taking forward some of the new areas of policy that we're looking at in this plan. Also, things like the definition of affordable housing, which in the previous plan that existed before there was any sort of real direct relationship with the housing minister, particularly around the definition of affordable housing. So that now sits outside the plan, albeit it has to relate to what is defined in the 2002 Island Planning Law as being as people who couldn't ordinarily access market housing. So it's very loose, high-level definition in the legal sense in the island plan from a kind of legal point of view. But the detailed elements of that affordable housing definition now sit firmly with the housing minister and the gateway. And obviously the access to affordable housing is very clearly defined to those people who qualify through the housing gateway under whatever criteria that are devised for that purpose. So it's a little bit more of a flexible approach, which gives us that kind of ability to then to change that definition outside of the plan rather than having to sort of rely on a change in the plan, which we would have had to have done previously if we kept that very detailed definition in the plan. So that introduces another area as well. So we've looked at something called right sizing, which we'll come on to, and as a concept of basically allowing people to vacate homes which they arguably might be under occupying, particularly family homes where the empty nesters and so on have left. And so that then frees up potentially in some cases family homes to those people wishing to sort of like start a family and move into that type of accommodation. And those types of homes obviously take up a reasonably large land area in Jersey, so it's trying to use our land and our stock in a far more efficient way. So the right sizing is something we're trying to introduce to this chapter as well. We've also, as Kevin explained before, in terms of the places and so on, the way we've structured the new plan. Previously we had in the green zone and coastal national park policies, where how we would want those areas developed for housing. That now sits within the housing chapter. So effectively we've taken out those elements and put them into the housing chapter. And also underpinning all of this, which is kind of very pertinent as well, is the new spatial strategy. And that spatial strategy drives a number of things. Obviously, it talks about where the best location is for all sorts of development across the island, but notably, obviously, for housing. We have a quite clear hierarchy going from the St Helier out to the sort of right to the rural areas. There's a sort of a natural sort of hierarchy there. But also we've introduced a new, or explicitly identified, I should say, Lekennebay as a sort of secondary urban area. And there's policies in the placemaking side of the plan that specifically talk about how that area of the island will be developed in the future, with more planning work and master planning addressing some of the areas, some of the issues around that particular part of the island. So that's the revised spatial strategy. As I said, the primary centre being St Helier is obviously sort of going to take the bulk and the proportion of most of our new housing development going forwards. Traditionally, it's ballparkish. It's been around 50% of all our new housing has been developed within that sort of part of the island, And so when we did a lot of our analysis, for example, on our call for sites and looked at housing potential sites, obviously the spatial strategy comes into that quite a lot in terms of more sustainable development being nearer the St Helier core as being the most appropriate site for new housing. And as I said, there's the sort of like a part of the town is there's a very direct involvement in terms of developing the town as a sort of new place to live. So we've got not a new place to live, I should say, as a improved place to live. So there's a town plan which is obviously looking at greater livability. That obviously connects to other policies in the island into this housing chapter in terms of density, in terms of residential standards, which are new policies that we've and proposals which we've interwoven into this particular housing chapter. And then also for Lekena Bay, as I touched on before, there's some work around developing Lekena Bay as well, and there's some more master planning and detailed future work that will go into sort of assessing and rolling out new proposals around the Lekena Bay area as well. So in terms of as a sort of overall summary, as a quick slide, these are the sort of the policies and proposals we have in the current revised housing chapter. You'll see there that there's a few policies that are existing. They've either tweaked and changed, or they've largely been left untouched in some cases, other than they've obviously now reflect the current language and the new direction of travel on some of the more kind of wider directions of travel around our corporate approach to, for example, key workers or other areas that we've worked on with things like the Housing Policy Development Board. There's also, as I said, new elements in there as well. Design for homes now sits firmly in there as a policy and a proposal. That SPG, I'll talk about that in a minute, will come hopefully in the next few months. Also, I said, as I touched on earlier, the housing in the countryside is, or another way of looking at housing outside the built-up areas, is a new policy as well, which I said it replaces the Green and Coastal National Park housing policy elements and has been strengthened to some extent as well as it states there. And then also further down in terms of the proposals, we've kind of reviewed and revisited the Future Housing Affordable, which is policy H3 as was, if people are familiar with that, from the 2011 Island Plan. And it came back as a proposal in 2014. We've kept it in as a proposal as a way of looking at future delivery of affordable housing beyond our current policy sort of approach around rezoning and using the estate to deliver that, the government property estate, that is. And as I said, the density standards are in there, and the design for homes is in there as well, as a sort of as a very clear message in terms of improving standards and making best use of our resources, efficient use of land, etc., etc. So I'll just dive into some of those individual areas on a slide-by-slide basis. I won't dwell on them too much, but obviously we can come back to any of these slides perhaps towards the end, or if Natasha picks out any messages that are urgent, we can maybe dwell, but I'll just try and go through these slides until we get to the end of that policy section. So in terms of policy H1, this is the housing quality and design. We have written some draft guidance, which have been quite long in the tooth in terms of trying to get those out the door. But these are going to come out, as I said, hopefully the next few months. And they cover internal minimal space standards, as it says there, indoor and outdoor amenity space, ventilation, heating, daylight, sunlight, and internal layouts. We found that sort of there's been a lot of developments, obviously, with a lot of pressure in town, and it's absolutely important, obviously, the sort of more pressure you put into the town for new developments, that they meet the best standards they can do for livability, for ensuring that people have the right amenities around those, as well as the sort of the visual and the kind of the sort of external appearance, if you like, of buildings. But in terms of how they run as buildings and how they work for the occupants is absolutely clear and key. to sort of making the town plan work properly in terms of how we want to sort of imagine the future of St Helier, and actually beyond St Helier as well. Obviously, the standards cover any type of housing across the whole island. So I said there's a new SPG heading your way fairly shortly, and that will be out for consultation as well in the normal way. Again, housing density sort of linked to that first policy on standards, again, is a key sort of new bit of guidance we're going to be publishing again, and it obviously then relates back to what I showed earlier, which is the spatial strategy. So different parts of the island will have different elements of density guidance that apply to them. We're looking to sort of obviously have a design-led approach, although there is a figure attached to these areas in terms of a kind of a range of densities we'd like to sort of like meet, which particularly work around efficient use of land, etc. Then they need to be sort of put in place pretty quick. So that's coming along soon. And again, in terms of so there's a slide I've missed out, but doesn't matter. Sorry, I've hidden a slide. I'll dig that out later. There's a slide which I can show, which is about the town, which just breaks that down a little bit in terms of the work we did with Willie Miller, so that informed to some extent some of the density levels in town around the character areas of town. So each character area has its own distinct type, and obviously we've got the historical core right out to the sort of waterfront and the more modern style development that's happening in that area, where obviously the levels of density will vary accordingly to sort of make sure that there's no impact or negative damage that can occur to the historic core, for example. But equally, there's areas of town where we are more able to provide a kind of a increased or higher density levels. So in terms of provision of homes, this is another new area of the plan where we've made it a policy where we are looking to meet a certain number of homes based around the evidence of demand. So if you read the previous publications that we've put out around the strategic options paper, for example, you'd know that we've got a challenge in terms of new migration levels. Equally, those levels have been prevailing for some time. So there's actually a latent demand figure as well from the previous plan that you could argue that we haven't met. So what we've done is we've looked at some population modelling around the Objective Assessment of Housing Needs report, which is part of the evidence base that's available out there at the moment, which you can read. And based on the 10-year requirement for the full island plan period, we had a figure of 6,100 homes a year based on our 800 persons per year. So that figure was around based on current thinking around obviously the restrictions with the economy at the moment and Brexit, COVID. And it's obviously in the absence of an absolute migration policy at the moment, but that is a reasonable figure that we think will kind of put us in good stead to sort of then plan for future homes on the island. So together with this latent demand, and if you boil that down in terms of the number that we get from that, plus also what we've identified, going back to my sort of efficient use of stock, there's other non-development kind of built development policy options whereby we might want to, or we envisage providing family homes through the sort of the reuse of existing homes in a much more efficient way, which I alluded to earlier. So we've identified around 200 units, or about 5% of that figure that we can then probably get from that type of non-development intervention. So what that leaves us with is a 5-year demand of around 3,750 homes, or 750 homes a year, which obviously is quite a significant number, and it's a number that's obviously higher than what we've probably accounted for or put into previous plans. But obviously that reflects this high level demand, and obviously this latent demand figure that we need to catch up on to some extent. So in terms of the policy itself, as I said, that gives us this figure of 3,950 minus the 200 from right sizing. We've identified about 1,500 affordable homes. That's from, and I'll come to that date breakdown in a minute, but in terms of it's stuff that's under sites that are already under construction, plus we've identified new sites through the rezoning options, plus sites we have under our own control as a government, which will become available through various periods of time. We're looking at, again, to sort of like provide more downsizing opportunities as well. That kind of links back to what I was saying about more efficient use of stock. And obviously with the rezoning as well, that allows us to provide for potentially more family homes, because they're in areas of the island which may lend themselves to more of that type of development rather than a flatter development, which you quite often get into town. That's not to say that family homes can't be adequately housed in flatter developments. Obviously, coupled with our improved residential standards and making town more livable, we want to encourage families obviously to live all over the island, and obviously in the most sustainable locations as well. It makes absolute sense for us to develop family homes through the sites we have identified in the town as well. We've also been in contact with the parishes. We obviously recognise that some of the parishes and the villages in particular could do with a sort of like an injection of more housing. That will help them support their communities better. It will also support the schools and obviously bring a little bit more vitality and life to some of those. And again, it obviously offers the opportunity, again, potential for some right sizing. Quite often people who want to downsize, they want to stay in their communities, but there isn't the opportunity to go into a right-sized or a smaller downsizing, affordable, more relevant home for them, I should say, but within their own community. So in terms of how that breaks down to supply, as I said, we've got quite a large under construction section at the moment in terms of where we are. And so you just have to look out the windows of your offices or walk through town or we'll drive around the island and you'll see a huge amount of cranes and construction sites busily working away, and obviously that's producing a reasonable number at the moment. There's also always an amount of planning permissions under which we have in the pipeline, which are obviously yet to start their construction phase, but they obviously will come forwards in the next plan period. So we've accounted for those as being sites that we've effectively got in the bag, so to speak. And then in terms of town capacity, we've done some work around that, again, in conjunction with the urban character appraisal work that we had done with, we worked with Willie Miller on. And so that's identified a number of private sites that we would expect to come forwards through some sort of development program from a private sector. But then also we've got a huge amount of, well, when I say huge, we've got a large stock of vacant potential property within government portfolio, and that huge potential is there because we've got two major capital programs underway. One of them is our hospital, which obviously will clear and vacate some older existing hospital or health related sites. Also, we've got a new office strategy coming on as well, so that will deliver a new office in town, and that will then equally release sites for alternative development use as well. Some of those sites are already underway in some shape or form. We've obviously got South Hill, we've got the Limes, and there's various other sites in that portfolio that will come forward. The ambulance station site, if and when the combined fire and ambulance station site is located or relocated, we'll free up the ambulance station site, and we've got St Saviour's Hospital, we've got La Barre, we've got a lot of other smaller sites as well, which cumulatively we believe will give us a reasonable supply. And then there's the sort of general development outside of the built-up areas. or outside of town, I should say, which go across the island from the private sector. And those last three lines there are the rezone sites. We just categorise those as strategic, being the ones within sort of the edge of town. Suburban, again, going out through our spatial strategy, and then the rural sites. So within the supply we have there, the 16 sites, which is in policy H5, which I'll show you in a second, we've estimated circa about 450 homes from that particular source. So that's on so numbers. The other policy that we've kind of retained but kind of just rejigged is policy H4 around housing, meeting housing needs. This was the housing mix policy. Again, it's making sure that when we do get developments, particularly large scale developments, that development meets the needs of the community. So that will be based on evidence around if it's affordable, obviously around the gateway lists. Otherwise, it's just around the housing needs surveys we conduct on a regular basis, or the longer term objective housing assessments report that we obviously looks at the longer term requirements. Obviously, we've got an ageing population, but we've also got affordability issues and various other sort of size and type requirements across the housing stock. So that's just making sure that developments match up with evidence of need, basically. So policy H5, which is probably the one that gets probably the most attention, that is around delivering affordable housing, and this is on rezoned sites. So we have gone through a process for assessing a large number of sites which were submitted as part of the corporate sites process, and that then sort of we whittled down to what we consider to be the best sites which were submitted that would meet the need that we've identified in those previous slides I showed you. Again, that some of these will support right sizing. So we've written into the policy the ability for some of these sites to be released for right sizing opportunities where that's appropriate and there is a demand and need for it. Everything as well, all of the sites need, all of the homes here and all the occupants of those homes will have to be assessed through the housing gateway. So they are genuinely in need of being in need of affordable housing. And obviously the type and number of, well, the type and size of those units on those sites will also be to some extent driven by, or certainly sort of evidenced by, what is the need through the gateway. Current evidence in very broad high level terms indicates that 55% are going to be for affordable purchase, and around 45% for social rent and rental. Again, we need to sort of make sure that they meet those broad, and this will change. I mean, all of these numbers are based on current evidence, and clearly, as and when these sites come forward, if all of these sites successfully went through the review process and came out the other end as being an approved site, then clearly in 2 years' time or a year's time, whenever it will be, that they come up for development, there might be a slight change in that number, but it is whatever the current evidence will be at that time. We also have put a bit of a stick in there as well. We've had one site from the previous 2014 revised island plan that was rezoned through for affordable housing, and it just hasn't come forward for whatever reason. The site has not been developed. So what we're going to be doing is putting in a stick to encourage that any sites to be put forward with a compulsory purchase stick attached. So just very quickly in terms of a visual, I suppose, right sizing, what's that mean? And, you know, we've got our demand over here, which is the gateway. We've got our existing stock in the middle here, and then we've got our new supply. So what we're saying is we could then end up with some of this existing stock being released for, and some of this is kind of obviously within the communities we have, and then we might have an element of downsizers going into some of the new supply, going forward. So that's just a visual representation of what I was describing earlier. Going forward, sort of, we put a kind of a marker in the sand on this one again, which is that although it's not a policy in the plan, it's just a proposal. What we're intending to do is, in the full island plan, is to, subject to viability checks and consultation, bring it forward as a policy that will then deliver affordable housing through private development. So what this policy will mean is that if you are a developer building, say, over a certain number of homes on a given site, what the policy would ask for is that a proportion of those homes are developed as affordable. And so that obviously would then provide an additional supply of affordable homes through existing windfall development. It might mean we do less greenfield rezoning in the future. Equally, it sort of, we could combine that with other policies as well. But so the idea is that as particularly government-owned sites will inevitably dry up, we're going to have to find alternative ways of delivering affordable housing going into the sort of longer term beyond this kind of bridging island plan period. So supported housing policy H6, again, we just developed a hook in the plan. Again, this was a policy that existed already. We haven't got any sites specifically identified, but we've obviously clearly it's a kind of it's a positive thing that will deliver supported housing where we can. This is effectively around extra care and residential housing, or homes, I should say. And so we would largely expect these to be developed within the built-up areas. And so this is just a hook to sort of identify that there's that positive policy direction of travel on that one. Key worker accommodation. So key workers accommodation is an area that we are working quite heavily with, particularly with health, obviously with the Our Hospital project. We're looking to reinvigorate and reimagine the existing supply that we have within government-owned stock. There's a lot of it is not in as good a condition as it could be. Some of it's actually vacant and completely not in use, such as Westaway Court. And so what we're looking to do is resupply reinvigorate that supply. And then that will then provide, to some extent, some additional key worker supply. We'll be working with Andium quite closely on that one, and obviously working with, or the housing minister will also need to work with the various directorates, particularly around health, around making sure that the key worker accommodation and the supply of it and the location of it fits in with future demands to support various government initiatives. So clearly there's a retention issue quite often, particularly with health workers and also with other key workers around government, and that's just making sure that the whole supply and policy is joined up. But there's a policy that obviously this relates to specifically to the land use element of that particular part. Oh, sorry, gone too many forwards. Sorry about that. Policy H8, as I said, this is a new policy. This has kind of replaced what was used to be in the green zone and coastal national park policies, and it just provides some detail around what will and won't be supported and what exceptions we do have and don't have in the kind of countryside, so outside of the built-up area, basically. So it sort of follows the kind of current thinking around what we had in the current plan, but it provides a little bit more clarity and definition around particularly the different types of development, so around extensions, conversions, and the redevelopment, and also where those developments might have an impact in terms of the curtilage extending into the countryside. We're looking to obviously protect the countryside from that type of incursion, and so that would be not supported. And then finally, policy H9, rural workers, again, similar to the current plan, effectively looking to sort of make sure that, again, that it can support the industry, but equally looking to only for, I said, occupation by bona fide agriculturalists. And obviously there'll be a test to make sure that they can't provide this accommodation in the existing built-up area or from areas that obviously don't then sort of impact upon the countryside. And there'll be obviously occupancy conditions and so on and so forth. Right, that was the housing policy section. Does anybody have any? I'm just reading through the chat. Actually, I'm just not been reading on that. Maybe I'll read.
Yeah, there's a range of questions in the chat, Ralph, that we've tried to pick up. So,
so have you responded to those, or do you want to pick those up now?
We've endeavoured to answer as many of them as we can. If there are any ones that people wanted to come back on or to ask for more information about, now's the opportunity, perhaps.
Yeah, Ralph, it's Mike Stein here.
Hello, Mike.
How are you doing? All right.
Yeah, good.
Thanks for your presentation.
That's right.
Yeah, the policy H8, the housing outside the built environment, the built-up area. Obviously, you've put in both the countryside, coastal national park, and the green zone into that one policy. So, how is there a distinction between development that's either in the green zone or in the coastal national park? Because the way I look at it, that policy is going to read the same pretty much for the whole of the coastal national park and the green zone.
Yeah, I'll let Kevin answer that one actually, because he is closer to that policy than I am.
Yeah, I think the key issue there, Mike, is around the landscape sensitivity and the character of the landscape and the impact of the proposal on the part of the island where it's proposed. So there is a general policy thrust that the level of development in the coastal national park is more restricted than in other parts of the island, and that's been set out in the places section of the plan. So this is, I suppose, making the point that you need to read the plan as a whole. So these thematic policies need to be considered with the place related policies at the front end of the plan, also together with the strategic policies. But it will be down to largely key issues around impact on landscape character where these exceptions might apply.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Just seen a question there from John Baker about percentage of social housing in SOJDC developments, please. I can't answer for SOJDC other than the fact that what we look at in terms of the portfolio is across the piece. Clearly, not every single site we identified is for affordable housing. So if you take South Hill, for example, that has been identified as open market housing. So, but overall, there's a very significant supply of new affordable homes from government-based sources, but not yet every site is down as affordable. Right. Okay. I just unless anyone's got any more questions, I'm just going to go to the final little section on housing sites. So what we did is we obviously went out for a call for sites process, received quite a large number of sites for consideration, a mixture of requests for housing of various types, also requests for retention as a kind of a existing use of, which is predominantly countryside. Also, we had some community use requests and light industrial and that sort of thing. So, but there was a large proportion of our requests were put forward for housing. So what we did is we went through a kind of desktop exercise to begin with, just to sort of sieve through the kind of suitability and ranking, if you like, of those sites against number of criteria. So taking you from the top to the bottom in that little table, Obviously, the spatial strategy was part and parcel of our thinking in terms of identifying the most sustainable locations for development, being clearly towards the primary and secondary centres, within or on the edge of it. So obviously anything that had no integration, that was slap bang in the middle of the countryside, was not obviously going to get a very good particular score from that particular category. We also did a suitability score again. So every part of the island was given a score between 0 and 100. So that was a balanced score that looked at it's the distance to the main urban areas, the bus routes, so basically a transport issue, access to shops, and also access to non-fee paying schools. That gave us a kind of scoring, which we then applied a rating to as well, and gave that score to each site. The revised country character study, the ILSCA work, we also used, and that again was ranked, and we obviously had the least sensitive scoring the highest score, being obviously in and around the urban area, and then obviously the cliffs and headlands, the least score, and they obviously went into the pot as well. What its current use was, so existing use of site. So I think someone asked a question about brownfield. I think that was covered off in the response. So brownfield obviously was seen as the most appropriate, down through to obviously community open space, recreation uses as being the least appropriate. Then there was some further work we did. So out of the ILSCA work, there was an additional bit of analysis that we asked them to do, which they did for sites around the kind of the villages and the urban areas, and so on the edges of developments, basically, in terms of their sensitivity, field sensitivity analysis. So that's been published as well, and that has anything from a low impact through to a high impact, obviously then went into the pot. And then finally we also looked at the flood risk as well. So sites that came up as either sort of like a high risk or a little risk were categorized as well. So what we then did is we then looked at all of those sites. It came up with a fairly large number that were seen as sort of being the best of those sites. We then went to we divvied up the work, and we went out and did a kind of a site review on site of all those sites that we felt were in the sort of like the top level of that kind of review that we did initially, the sort of like the first sift, and then we then came down to a final 16, I think it was 15, of which one of them in St John's had already gone through a public inquiry. That was Field 525, but then the other 15 were sites that we've brought forward as new rezoning potential. And that report there, as it says at the bottom of that slide, is available in the Housing, Land Availability and Assessment of Sites report, which you can read in a little bit more detail from what I just described to you just now. So they were the sites. There was also some sites that we grouped. So sites, for example, 2, 3, 4, we see as coming together equally. Sites 389, 390, that's number 6 on that list. Number 8, 594, 595, and 1. We see coming together as development, and the St Saviour's sites of 413, 15, 15A, 470 as being brought as a kind of a comprehensive scheme for redevelopment, as we've identified in the plan. So that's the presentation on the housing chapter and sites. I'm opening the floor now, but there's obviously another slide we can finish off with on how to engage, but I won't go to that yet because I think you probably have some questions on the bit we just presented to date. None? Is it all good?
I've got one observation, if I may.
I can see Kate has got her hand up. Well, does Kate want to? If you could use the.
Oh, I can use the hand. Okay, well, I tell you what, we'll use the hands up.
Yeah. Hi, it's Kate here. I've got a question actually about the rezoning of the sites. You said rezoned in that slide. So can you explain what circumstances there would be whereby some of these fields won't be rezoned? I mean, are you assuming they're all going to be rezoned for affordable housing?
Yeah, sorry, when I say rezoning, what that is that means that they'll be identified to be, because currently all those sites will be down under the current plan as probably greenfield, green zone, and in most cases. And so when I say rezoning, they're going from rezoning from their current use, which is current category of green zone, into affordable housing. So it's under policy H5, and they'll all be rezoned as 100% affordable housing. And obviously that requires, you know, we're at the consultation stage, so nothing's happened yet. This goes through to the consultation phase we're in at the moment, public inquiry, states debate. Once you've had a states debate and all those sites are, if they're all approved, it's only at that point then obviously you then have a plan that you can deliver and they become potential affordable housing sites.
Okay, and just a quick follow-up. If it's rezoned for affordable housing, that presumably does include the right sizing. Does that include sort of retirement homes?
Yeah, we've allowed for it in the policy, so that a small percentage could come forward where there's an evidence of local need to support, and they can. And the other thing about that as well is that it needs to release a home that will then effectively be provided to someone in need on the kind of the family affordable housing category bracket as well. So we're putting in a mechanism. We're talking to the housing providers about ways in which we can release a small number of units on some of these rezoned sites for that purpose, but they have to be completely linked to releasing an affordable home for a first-time buyer family.
Okay, so you wouldn't be likely that you could have a whole one of those fields that was just for right sizing or sheltered accommodation.
I wouldn't say never, but I mean that's not the intention of the policy. Okay. At this stage, but obviously we're in consultation phase, so it could end up, you know, we could end up having a kind of mixed development type across different parishes, perhaps.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
I can see Mike's got his hand up. Right?
Oh, hi, Mike.
Hi, yeah, thanks very much. That's really interesting. I'm just curious to know your team's view on whether or not you think we have a housing crisis, because I think, well, I personally think we do, and I think in the same way, applying the word crisis to the climate crisis, it's brought it into much sharper political focus, and I sense we should be doing something similar with housing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with the sort of sentiment, and that, I mean, this term first came up actually at public inquiry from I think the report we had done in 2014, the public inquiry, if I remember rightly, and it was raised then, and I think the inspectors sort of were fairly sort of well, I think they sort of largely agreed that there probably was a housing crisis, and that was way back in 2014, and I don't think there's been anything done since that means that we're in less of a crisis than we are now. So I mean, you only have to look at house prices and the kind of the way the market has reacted in the last 12 to 24 months to know that to get on particularly on the affordable level of housing is getting harder and harder and harder, and the income level gap, if you like, between being able to get on the basic rung of a housing ladder now is kind of out of reach for many people, or a lot more people quite potentially. I mean, we haven't done there's not been a housing needs survey done since 2017, 18, I think it was. And I imagine if you did one today, it would probably highlight quite strongly there is a kind of certainly a need and a gap in that affordable housing sector particularly.
Yeah, I think as you know, just to pick up on that point, one of the reasons why the minister was so keen to bring the plan forward, you know, because there was some question as to whether or not we delayed the island plan review when the pandemic first hit, and the minister was quite keen to ensure that we did undertake an island plan review specifically to address some of the challenges that exist in terms of housing and particularly the provision of affordable homes. So, and I think if you look at the provision that this plan is seeking to make in terms of addressing housing, there's quite a significant amount of housing being brought forward to help to address that particular need.
It's just I did a word search of the plan, and the word crisis doesn't come up once.
We want to panic people.
Yeah, perhaps you should perhaps you should do a word search on homes, Mike.
There's plenty of those. I did.
There's plenty of those.
Homes and supply.
Yeah.
I think John Baker's got a question.
Yes, thanks. Generally about amenity space, but specifically the Parish Roads Committee recently went out and did some site visits of the green fields that have been suggested to be used for housing up at Montalabé, on the left-hand side, practically opposite Jackson Garage, and also there's a couple of fields, but they ostensibly one large field next to Hope Valley. It did occur to the whole of the committee that with this sort of ribbon development that's gone up Queen's Road and then continued along Montalabé doesn't allow enough green space and amenity space, and to lose those fields it would be a real shame. But in particular the Hope Valley field, which is surrounded not just by next door to the school but surrounded by residential. And whilst we were up there in that field, quite a lot of people were using that field as a bit of a shortcut and enjoying the open space, and we really do feel that those open spaces there, rather than going into housing, should be amenity spaces. They could be pocket parks, they could be mini forests, they could be children's play areas, and to lose more green space in St Helier would be a crying shame when we have a lack of green space and a lack of parks and open amenity space in St Helier. I asked a question earlier in the chat, which Natasha has replied to, that you have some policy for this. But I can't see you guys planning amenity space. You look to be pushing and planning for housing, and you have policy for amenity space. But why are you not saying, well, we need to save this space and we need to save that space for amenity space? Otherwise, we're going to just end up with St Helier covered in concrete and no greenery.
Karen, do you want to go on that?
Yeah. Clearly, important
point.
points that you raised there, John. I'd suggest that you look at the places section of the plan, where we talk about the plan for town, and I think Ralph touched on it in his presentation about it isn't about just about the provision of numbers of homes. It's about providing good quality living space, but also a good quality neighbourhood as well, where people have access to open space. So I'd encourage you to come along to the thematic webinar when we talk about community infrastructure, and we'll talk in more detail there about the policy provision that the plan's making in terms of providing different forms of open space. But I don't know if, Natasha, do you want to touch on some of the key policy recommendations around provision of open space in the plan, just to give John a little flavour of what that part of the plan contains.
Okay, so there's 3 sites that are specifically designated for open space to the benefit of town residents. That is securing the designation of part of the Gas Place site for an extension to Millennium Town Park. That is securing Warwick Farm for future use as a country park, which has the opportunity for kind of woodland connectivity in through Valley de Vaux, Adelina Wood, and then upwards to the northern parishes. And we're also proposing a strategic countryside access site to Granvaux Reservoir, which would get full connectivity in terms of pedestrian connectivity from town up around the reservoir and through the wooded valley up again into the northern parts of Trinity. So those 3 schemes are designated for this short-term bridging island plan. And we've also said that we would monitor the proportion of open space for town residents relative to the audit that was undertaken in 2018. And I note that Mike has asked in the chat if this has been published. The answer is yes. You'll find it in the evidence-based page. I can send a link in a moment to that for you. But those three things in particular, we're hoping will boost the availability of space in town, but we also recognise that as we continue to put more development in town, that will lead to more pressure on open space. But it is, of course, not just about how much space we have, but also about the quality and accessibility of that space. So there are other things like the public realm schemes that you'll see are listed in the travel and transport policy that will improve the smaller public spaces to town residents.
Okay, that sounds pretty good, and I think I'm glad you mentioned, the connectivity thing. You'd be pleased to hear I was up at Manor Park today. I had a chat with the chap who's been criticised for felling trees up there. In fact, they weren't woodland; they were garden trees, cherry trees, and things. Anyway, he was talking. I'll just be brief about connecting Manor Park through his woodland down to Valley de Vaux, so that one can walk up Valley de Vaux and actually access up through that national Jersey National Trust property through some of that private land up there, which we'll get permission to, right through Manor Park up to the school. So it's the connectivity. It's not just the green open spaces, but having the easy and safe access, so that you can say to a young child, okay, you can go to the local park and play and not worry that they have to go on a main road. So it's walkability and safety and connectivity.
Yeah, so the 2016 Countryside Access Strategy obviously supports that position. So the Minister for the Environment outside of the plan would also seek to support, endorse, encourage that kind of use happening.
Thank you.
I can see Hannah has a question.
Yes, like John, I'm concerned about the Montelabe area. I don't know if anyone's done a survey on the traffic around that area, but it's absolutely appalling. I mean, it's constant traffic the whole time. With those three fields built on and the extra houses, it's going to be even worse. I mean, we've got two schools nearby. We've got the potential new hospital, which is being built just up the road. With ambulances whizzing along. I just don't think that's been taken into account. Can you tell me if anyone's done a survey on the traffic there?
We haven't done a specific survey on the traffic there, but as part of all of the site assessments, we've engaged with our colleagues in the infrastructure, housing and environment transport section to consult them about any key issues associated with access and road safety on all of those sites. But clearly, if those are the issues that you're concerned about on that particular site, then I'd encourage you to make those comments known to us through the consultation portal.
They are, and I mean, I don't know if the new hospital has been taken into account at all for this area.
Well, certainly in terms of the work that's being done to look at the traffic to and from the hospital, there are sort of major studies being undertaken to look at access to the hospital. I believe most of the routing of traffic for that will be up and down the enhanced Westmount Road access, but undoubtedly there will be some attraction to traffic coming from the north as well to some extent.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Anybody else? I can see, is it John Howell with a question?
And Andy, I'm sorry I've joined a bit late, and someone might have already said this, but I'm just really worried about the population. And I think we should be thinking about that first before we go ahead and just concreting over all these fields.
Okay, well, thanks.
Been letting in, over 1,000 people every year when they promised it was going to be maximum of 325 per year. And that's why we're in a mess. We shouldn't, Jersey, I think, should be really having a population policy first.
Well, clearly, as you say, the population policy is the tool that sets the framework within which other parts of the government need to operate, and the island plan is is not the tool that sets the island's population policy. It seeks to respond to specifically to things like housing need from the population that is projected to require housing during the plan period. So, the island plan doesn't set those population policies for the island. It simply seeks to respond to the community needs for development, which is obviously driven by the population that's already here, but also the population that will change during the plan period. But I understand the point that you're making. I can see Steve with a question.
Yes, good afternoon. It's an issue that hasn't been raised concerning the actual planning process that we use on the island. It doesn't seem to be very joined up. We have developers wishing to, we have architects submitting plans, it goes to housing, it gets rejected for whatever reason, and it seems a very cumbersome process that could be streamlined by perhaps a consultative meeting taking place at the beginning. There's no point in submitting a plan when it's going to be rejected for whatever reason. If there was more consultation at the outset between planning, the developer, the architects, and other interested parties.
Okay, yeah, it's a good point. Clearly, we're at the plan making stage at the moment, so we're effectively setting out the ground rules that would be used to assess any development proposals that might emerge during the plan period. And I suppose there's a couple of points to make in relation to your comments. The first of those is that one of the things we're proposing in this plan is that there's a requirement for larger scale development for there to be evidence of community participation before any planning application is submitted. So that's a policy recommendation that's set out in this plan to encourage the sponsors of development to engage with the local community before they bring forward a planning application. And the purpose of that is really to talk to local residents, local stakeholders, talk to them about their proposals, and to identify any issues and challenges, and hopefully to try and mitigate or resolve them as part of the design process before they submit a planning application. The other thing I would say is that my colleagues who deal with planning applications seek to encourage developers to engage with them prior to submitting planning applications, particularly for larger scale development, so that any planning issues can be identified and again mitigated as far as possible before planning applications are made. And that includes engagement with something called the Jersey Architecture Commission, which is a body that's able to provide independent architectural critical advice about schemes that might come forward. And again, it's best to engage the Architecture Commission prior to a planning application being submitted. So there are efforts made to try and resolve issues as far as possible prior to planning applications being submitted. But of course, the open process is that's where stakeholders can raise formal objections to planning applications should they so wish, if they feel that they haven't been resolved before the application is made.
I mean, my point, if you excuse me, just coming back to you on this, take Andium with the we'll call it the Town Park Bon Marché area. It's the initial application was submitted, rejected on size and overdevelopment. It was reduced by approximately 50%, and it's been rejected again for whatever reason. If this was the case at the outset, a lot of time and effort and expense for all concerned, whether it be Andium, the architects and so on, so that people know where they stand. It's pointless putting in an application for something that is going to get rejected for whatever reason.
Yeah, well, I don't want to go into the details of a particular case, but I'm sure they were given advice prior to that application being made, and I believe they also had an existing consent prior to that second application, but we won't delve into the detail of that one. Just wondering, I know we are I've got a couple of minutes left, but are there any last questions that people want to raise just before we move on to the wrapping the session up? No. Okay. Well, I suppose just this last slide was really just to thank you for attending today. Hope you found it useful. There are some more webinars that will take place on other sections of the plan. As I say, they are themed by subject area, mainly just as a way of getting through the content. So please feel free to book into those. You can come along to one of the parish drop-in sessions, as I mentioned earlier, and clearly there's a whole raft of information available online. If you did wish to discuss any issues in detail with us, there will be a surgery held this Friday, where you can have book a 30-minute slot with one of the Island Plan review team, and we'll send the link to book those slots at the end of this session, so you can follow the link. And I think Natasha's just posted it into the chat actually, so you can book a session using that link. And as I mentioned at the outset, we are in the live consultation period on the draft plan. So if you do wish to make a formal comment and you want to register a comment in relation to the plan, then please use the consultation portal. So that was it. Thank you very much for attending, and we might see some of you at some of the events in the future. So thanks very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.